Okay, let's unpack this. When you think about gossip or, backbiting in a modern context, what comes to mind? Usually it's something pretty mild, right? Workplace chatter, maybe a little guilt, a reputation for being petty. It's seen as a social flaw. But when we do a deep dive into classical Islamic ethics, this act, which has a very precise definition, Ghibah, it's it's not a simple social issue. It is framed as one of the most destructive sins in the entire ethical system.
Precisely. And that's really what this deep dive is for. It's for the listener who wants to get a really thorough, nuanced understanding of these big ethical concepts and get it quickly. Our whole mission today is to move way past that simple, often incorrect translation of gossip. We're going to analyze Ghibah as a complete conceptual framework. We're looking at a system that makes these incredibly fine distinctions between, say, true statements spoken behind someone's back versus outright slander or tale carrying, or even just, mocking someone with a gesture.
Yeah.
We have to see the moral architecture behind it.
Right. And the initial hook, the thing that tells you just how serious this is incredibly visceral. The sources liken this act, just talking negatively about someone, to the ultimate form of revulsion. I mean, we're exploring why it's equated to eating the flesh of one's own dead brother. That image alone just pulls the whole topic out of the realm of, casual office talk and puts it squarely in the category of a spiritual crisis.
It's the conceptual anchor for the whole prohibition, that analogy from Surah Al-Hujurat. And to really understand why it carries so much weight, we have to lean on the precision of classical scholarship. So our sources for this are rooted in those technical definitions from scholars like Ibn al-Tin and al-Jawari, the deep commentary on the Quranic verses, of course the narrations, the hadith, which detail everything from the consequences to the rules for avoidance and even the exceptions. This is truly an analysis of moral architecture.
Okay, so let's start with the foundation. The linguistic level is always the best place to begin. The term is Ghibah. What's the root word there?
It comes from the Arabic root Ghibah, and Ghibah literally means absence or anything that is hidden from the eyes.
Hidden from the eyes. Okay.
So that's the absolute foundational concept we need to get. The word Ghibah is derived from that, so it means the act of speaking about someone specifically when they're not present. The entire definition is built on that circumstance.
So conceptually, it's the absence that defines the harm.
Exactly. It's a violation of their right to be present, to defend themselves, to clarify, to refute. The harm is done in a way that's almost cowardly. It targets their reputation where they are most vulnerable, when they can't speak for themselves. That's the first pillar of the definition.
And when the scholars developed the technical, the terminological definition, they made it incredibly precise. How did someone like, say, Zayn al-Din al-Manawi define it?
Al-Mawla defined it as mentioning a person in a way that they would dislike behind their back.
Yeah.
But, and this is a critical detail, he made sure to include not just speech, but also gestures and mimicry.
Oh, that's huge.
It's a key conceptual point because it shows how rigorous the framework is. It's not just about the words you say. It's any action that conveys disrespect or belittles someone in their absence.
So the eye rolling, the sarcastic sigh, imitating someone's walk or their voice, all of that is included. It makes the ethical framework so complete because it anticipates all the subtle ways we communicate disrespect. It's about protecting a person's dignity in a total sense.
Absolutely. Ibn al-Tin had a similar focus, mentioning a person's faults in their absence.
Yeah.
And al-Jawari gave us the simplest, most effective test.
What's that?
He said, Ghibah is to speak about a person in their absence in a way that would upset them or cause them pain if they heard it. If they'd be distressed by it, it qualifies. That's the litmus test.
Okay, now let's get to what I think is the most crucial conceptual distinction. This is the one that really surprises people who just think of this as generic gossip. It all comes down to the truth of the statement. The difference between Ghibah and Ghibah. What's the other term?
Bhutan.
Bhutan. So what's the difference?
This is absolutely paramount because it determines the category of the sin. It's simple. If the negative statement you make about the absent person is true, if the flaw you're pointing out is actually in them, that is Ghibah.
And if the negative statement is just a lie, something you made up,
then the sin is elevated. It becomes Bhutan, which means false accusation or slander.
let's use a clear example to lock that in. If I say to a friend, our boss is always so disorganized in meetings, and, he really is disorganized, that's Ghibah. I've exposed a true hidden fault.
Correct.
But if I say our boss is stealing office supplies, and that's a complete fabrication.
That's Bhutan. That's the line. And this immediately brings up a question, doesn't it? In most Western ethical systems, truth is an absolute defense. I was just telling the truth. Why doesn't that apply here?
Exactly. For the learner, this is usually the biggest point of friction. Why is exposing a true fault considered such a major ethical failure?
The analysis from the sources is really clear on this, and it boils down to the concepts of honor and concealment. Ghibah is about violating a person's honor and dignity, even with factual information. The idea is that an individual has a right for their faults, even real ones, to be kept private. The framework suggests that God, in his mercy, conceals these faults, and when you expose them, you're interfering with that divine act of concealment.
Wow.
Bhutan, on the other hand, is seen as conceptually worse because it's a compound violation. You've violated their honor, and you've added the massive sin of falsehood. You're bearing false witness. So both are major sins, but Bhutan is intensified. Ghibah remains a major sin because it's a betrayal of the spiritual trust that's supposed to exist within the community.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the ethical system doesn't just stop with those two categories. Understanding these finer conceptual differences helps you map the entire landscape of harmful speech. It's not a monolith.
Right, you need to see it as a spectrum. The sin is measured by the truth of the claim, the intention of the speaker, and even how it was delivered. Al-Hassan al-Basri gave a really useful three-part categorization of these levels of harmful speech.
Okay, let's break down those three aspects he laid out.
So first you have Ghibah, backbiting. That's speaking about your brother what is actually true about him. This is that baseline offense, violating privacy and honor by exposing a hidden truth.
Okay, and the second one is iftak. What's that?
Iftak refers to speaking about him what you have only heard or been told. This is the sin of reckless transmission, basically. Hearsay.
So you don't even know if it's true or false.
Exactly. You're just passing on potentially damaging information without verifying it. The sin there is the lack of due diligence, the willingness to participate in spreading unconfirmed harm.
And then the third, which we've mentioned, is Bhutan.
Right. The most severe. Saying about him what is not true at all. A complete, malicious invention. Al-Jurjani really solidified this, explaining that backbiting mentions existing faults, while false accusation invents faults that do not exist. This structure shows how concerned the framework is with the source of the information. Is it verified truth, hearsay, or a flat-out lie?
So that's all based on the veracity of the claim, but the sources also introduce concepts related to the intent and the method of the speech. These feel more like active forms of harm. I'm thinking of namima, gams, and lams.
Differentiating these is so important for the learner because they get at different psychological drivers. Let's start with namima.
Namima is usually translated as tale-carrying or malicious gossip. What's the conceptual core of it?
The defining feature of namima is not just the content, but the malicious intent to cause discord. It's spreading information about someone specifically to create hatred, to cause a fight, to break up a friendship or a marriage. The prohibition is aimed squarely at protecting the social fabric. A person doing namima is acting like a corrosive agent in the community.
It sounds like an absolute prohibition. But are there any exceptions here? Is there a situation where this could be permissible?
There are, but the conceptual line is incredibly thin. Nama is forbidden when the intent is malice. But the sources allow for an exception if the intent shifts from malice to necessary protection. So if the information is about a verifiable threat like someone is planning to harm you financially or physically, then conveying that information is permissible. The ethical priority becomes safety, and that outweighs the general rule against tale-carrying.
That makes perfect sense. The intent is defensive, not destructive. Okay, what about gams and lams? They often appear together in the texts.
They're like twin concepts, both focused on mockery and insult. Gams is very specific. It's criticizing or mocking someone in their presence.
Oh, face-to-face.
Yes, using direct verbal insults or physical gestures like a dismissive hand wave or a sneer. The focus is on immediate public degradation.
And lamas. It's often confused with gaba. How do we separate them?
So lams is insulting or defaming someone, either in their absence or using indirect cutting remarks. Here's the key difference. Ghibah is about exposing a hidden fault, even a true one. Lams is more about active defamation and degradation. It's using harsher, more targeted language. When the Quran says, "Woe to every slanderer and backbiter," one of the great commentators, Mujahid, clarified that the backbiter, Ghibah, eats people's flesh, while the slanderer, lams, mocks and insults them. Lams has this element of open hostility, of verbal abuse aimed at just destroying someone's dignity. So if I say behind someone's back, he's short, that's Ghibah. But if I say, did you see that little runt? To actively insult and demean him, that's moving into the territory of lambs. Exactly. One exposes a flaw, the other weaponizes it for degradation. And what this whole spectrum, Ghibah, Bhutan, Ifke, Namima, Gams, and lambs really shows is the incredible precision of this ethical map. A sin is judged not just by its truth, but by location present or absent, by method, speech, or gesture, and by the speaker's ultimate intention.
All right, so when we move from defining the concepts to looking at the condemnation, we come face to face with the raw, visceral power of this framework. We have to go back to that analogy in Surah al-Hujurat. Would one of you like to eat the flesh of his dead brother? You would detest it. This is the conceptual tool that makes the prohibition feel so absolute.
It's an unmatched rhetorical device. It's designed to provoke moral repulsion. Imam al-Shawkani, in his commentary, really breaks down the layers of disgust here. First, you have the natural human revulsion to eating carrion, dead, rotting flesh. Then you add the horror of it being human flesh. And finally, the ultimate psychological and ethical horror of it being the flesh of your own spiritual brother, someone you are obligated to protect and love.
It literally transforms a social mistake into an act of spiritual cannibalism. It suggests you are metaphorically devouring their dignity, their good deeds, their spiritual life force.
That is the core conceptual function of that simile. It's meant to make the act of Ghibah unthinkable by tying it to one of our most primal, instinctive feelings of revulsion. And this idea is then consistently reinforced in the narrations from the Sunnah, which lay out the very real spiritual consequences.
One of the most powerful hadith on this is about spiritual pollution. I'm thinking of the one about the tainted sea.
Ah, yes. A powerful metaphor for the level of spiritual filth. The Prophet's wife Aisha made a comment about his other wife, Safiya, perhaps about her height. And the Prophet's response was incredibly severe. He said, "You have spoken a word that if you were to mix it with the water of the sea, it would taint it."
Wow. Just think about the sea, this vast, enormous, purifying body of water. The idea that a single word of backbiting could corrupt its very essence gives you an alarming sense of that word's inherent corruption.
It does. And Imam al-Nawawi understood this conceptual scaling perfectly. He called this one of the most severe warnings against gossip because it equates this seemingly small act with a kind of systemic environmental contamination. The sin isn't just contained in the conversation. Its negative spiritual energy spreads out like a pollutant.
And the condemnation doesn't stop there. It extends to punishment in the grave itself. There's that famous hadith that links tale-carrying, namima, with punishment for neglecting purity.
This is so important for understanding the ethical weight here. The Prophet passed by 2 graves and said their inhabitants were being punished. One was for being careless about purification after urinating, and the other was for engaging in namima. By placing namima, and by extension its close cousin Ghibah, on the same level of severity as a fundamental neglect of a religious duty, it elevates it to the status of a kabira, a major sin. Violating community trust is treated as seriously as violating a direct rule of worship.
And then this punishment is visualized physically in the hereafter, which brings us right back to that cannibalistic analogy.
Yes. During the Mirage, the night journey, the Prophet witnessed people who were scratching their faces and chests with copper nails, a horrific self-inflicted torment. And he was told, "These are the ones who used to eat the flesh of people and defame their honor." This vision just solidifies the concept. The spiritual consumption of another's dignity results in a physical, agonizing retribution. The nails are a symbol of the sharpness of the tongue, now turned back against the self.
But I think for the average believer, the person who prays and fasts and gives charity, maybe the most terrifying consequence is the idea of spiritual bankruptcy on the day of judgment. This links Ghibah directly to the concept of moral debt.
This is the practical bottom-line consequence of the dead brother's flesh analogy. The famous hadith of the bankrupt person describes someone who comes on Judgment Day with a mountain of good deeds, prayers, fasting, charity, everything. But during their life, they insulted this person, slandered that person, backbit another. And so the people they wronged come and take from their pile of good deeds, their hasanat, as repayment for the debt against their honor. And if their good deeds run out before the debts are paid, the sins of the victims are then piled onto the backbiter, making them morally bankrupt and ensuring their ruin.
So every single act of Ghibah is basically an irreversible transfer of your spiritual currency. You are literally giving away your salvation every time you violate someone's honor.
It creates this moral ledger where human dignity is the most valuable and volatile asset. And the gravity of this is underscored when the Prophet declared that a person's blood, your wealth, and your honor are sacred to you. He put violating honor on the same level as murder and theft.
And what about linking it to economic sins? There's that narration that says, the worst form of usury is attacking the honor of your Muslim brother. Usury itself is a massive sin. Why frame Ghibah as even worse?
Because usury is a financial crime, it harms the economic system. But attacking someone's honor is a crime against their soul and against the trust of the entire community. It poisons the social system and risks eternal damnation through that transfer of good deeds. This comparison just reveals a profound ethical hierarchy where dignity and reputation are valued even more highly than material wealth. It's this philosophical underpinning that led scholars like Ibn Hajar to definitively classify backbiting as a major sin, a kabira, that demands immediate and sincere repentance.
Okay, so now that we've established the gravity, we need to map out the scope. When the definition is mentioning a person in a way they dislike, that applies to, well, basically every facet of their being. The sources are so exhaustive here, it shows the prohibition isn't just about big moral failings.
Right. Imam al-Ghazali, in his framework, meticulously categorized the scope of Ghibah just to make sure there were no loopholes. It applies to any attribute a person would dislike being mentioned, whether it's something they were born with or something they acquired.
Let's walk through his categories just to give the listener a real-world sense of how comprehensive this is. First up is physical traits.
This covers mentioning any physical aspects someone might be sensitive about, saying they're cross-eyed or bald or too short, or commenting on their weight or skin color. For instance, saying behind someone's back, he always has that slight limp when he walks, even if it's true, is Ghibah because it's exposing a physical trait he'd probably prefer not to have publicly discussed.
Okay, next is lineage and background.
This is criticizing someone based on their social status, their family, their origin, calling someone a peasant or low class, or using their profession or nationality to demean them. This would even include sarcastic labels, like saying, well, what do you expect? He's just a stereotype profession, if the intent is to belittle their status.
Then we get to what is probably the most common category, character traits.
This covers all the psychological and temperamental flaws, calling someone ill-tempered, stingy, arrogant, a coward, a show-off. If you complain to a friend, she's so stingy she never donates to anything, that is classic Ghibah. You're exposing a true flaw in her character that she would hate to have broadcast.
What about religious actions? Because you often hear people criticizing how others practice their faith.
This is a major, major trap. It includes criticizing the quality of someone's prayer, saying they're careless with their charity, or accusing them of showing off in their worship. For example, if you see someone praying for a long time and you remark to someone else, he's just trying to impress everyone, you have engaged in Ghibah because you are judging his hidden intention and exposing a potential flaw, hypocrisy, which you would absolutely dislike being mentioned.
Okay, then there's worldly behavior.
This is about habits and manners. Saying someone is ill-mannered, talks too loud, laughs inappropriately, is too aggressive in conversation, or eats too much. Any comment on a person's social conduct that they would find embarrassing falls under this.
And finally, and this seems almost absurdly detailed, but it's in there, belongings.
It just shows the breadth of the ethical protection. Criticizing someone's property. Their car is old, their house is small, their clothes are dirty or out of style. The point is, Ghibah covers every facet of a person's life, spiritual, physical, social, and material, if the comment would cause them pain.
This exhaustive list really drives home the conceptual goal, complete and total respect for an individual's dignity. But of course, people are experts at finding loopholes, which brings us to the really critical concept of hidden Ghibah, all the subtle, indirect ways of doing it.
These hidden forms are the ones that demand so much self-awareness. The act of Ghibah often starts in the heart before it ever reaches the tongue. The story of Ibrahim ibn Adham is so instructive here. He refused to even sit in a gathering where people were backbiting. He even went so far as to fast for 3 days just for having been present. And his reason was profound. By listening, he implicitly approved of the act and thus harmed his own spiritual state. The listener is a conceptual participant.
So what are some of these specific techniques people use for hidden Ghibah where they can pretend they're not actually sinning?
One of the most common is feigning surprise. When someone starts gossiping, the listener reacts with this exaggerated shock. No, I can't believe they did that, which just eggs the speaker on, encourages them to say more. It makes the listener a psychological accomplice.
Right. And we also see people using religious language to kind of cloak their criticism. This is the sympathetic criticism.
Exactly. This is when you mention someone's faults, while pretending to feel deep sorrow or concern for them. You'll hear things like, "May God guide him. I really worry about his terrible temper." You frame the exposure of the flaw as an act of prayer. But the real action is still exposure. The intent is still to convey the negative trait.
And then there's the subtle undermining you see in professional settings all the time, backhanded praise.
The classic. It starts with praise, which can be sincere or not, but it's immediately followed by a but that introduces the actual flaw. He's a brilliant analyst, a real asset to the team, but he's just so reckless with deadlines, it's going to be his downfall. The whole point of the sentence was to deliver that criticism under the cover of a balanced assessment.
And of course, the nonverbal version, mimicry.
Imitating someone's voice, their walk, their mannerisms, specifically to mock them. This is considered Ghibah by action. Even if no words are spoken, the intent to belittle through imitation violates their dignity and is forbidden.
This all brings us to the common learner's traps, these scenarios where people wrongly assume the prohibition doesn't apply. The first one is, well, I'd say it to his face.
A complete misunderstanding of the conceptual boundary. If you say something disliked to their face, okay, it's no longer Ghibah because that requires absence, but it immediately becomes gams, direct insult, which is also prohibited. The sin just changes its name, the prohibition remains.
The second trap, using veiled language.
Right, using phrases like, some people I know, or a certain person in our office. If the context or the details make the target identifiable to your audience, it is still Ghibah. The framework judges the outcome, the damaged reputation, not the cleverness of your phrasing.
And the third big one, which we touched on earlier, backbiting someone who is a known sinner.
This requires very careful delineation. In general, backbiting a known sinner is still forbidden because the core definition, mentioning something they dislike, still applies. They still have a right to have their faults, especially their private ones, concealed. However, the sources do acknowledge a limited exception. If a person commits a sin publicly and openly, without shame, the prohibition on mentioning that specific public sin is lifted, but only for the purpose of warning others or seeking their correction. You cannot use their public sin as a free pass to then expose all their private faults or unrelated character flaws.
That nuance is everything. The right to concealment is only forfeited for that specific public action and only for a constructive purpose. That's what stops the exception from becoming a malicious free-for-all. This is probably the most sophisticated and conceptually mature part of the whole framework. We've established that Ghibah is forbidden by consensus. Yet scholars like Imam an-Nawawi systematically laid out scenarios where it becomes permissible, or mubah, and sometimes even obligatory, wajib. This isn't a contradiction, is it? It's more like an ethical calculus.
That's the perfect way to put it. It's an ethical calculus where a higher necessary benefit outweighs the fundamental harm of violating someone's honor. These 6 exceptions exist because in these specific situations, silence would actually lead to a greater evil, the breakdown of justice or safety or religious integrity. The purpose has to shift entirely from malicious exposure to constructive necessity.
Okay, let's detail the first scenario. Complaint to authority.
This is Ghibah that's necessary for justice. It's a wronged person reporting an oppressor to a judge or someone in a position of authority who can provide a remedy. You go to the judge and say, X stole my money, or Y abused me. The Ghibah is essential to even start the legal process. The intent here is purely justice, not gossip.
Second, seeking to remove a wrong.
This is when you report a wrongdoer to a third party who has the direct power to stop the sin from happening. For instance, you see someone engaging in a harmful act, and you tell their parent or their mentor or someone with authority over them, specifically so they can intervene and correct the behavior. The speech is confined only to the necessary fault and only to the person who can fix it.
Third is seeking a fatwa, or religious guidance.
Right. When you go to a scholar for advice, you often have to describe the injustice to get a valid ruling. The classic example is the woman who asks for a ruling about her abusive husband. She has to describe his mistreatment, which is Ghibah, in order to receive the correct spiritual or legal guidance. Now, scholars recommend using vague language if you can, like what of a person's spouse. But if specificity is required, it becomes permissible.
And the fourth one is huge. It's vital for the health of the community, warning others and giving necessary advice.
This is a really broad category of communal protection. It covers so many essential social functions. For example, financial warnings. Telling a friend not to go into business with someone you know is a fraud. Or marital warnings, advising against marrying someone known to be violent. But the ultimate example of obligatory Ghibah is the scholarly tradition of Jarh wa Ta'dil.
The science of narrator criticism.
Exactly. Scholars would dedicate their lives to assessing the trustworthiness of people who narrated hadith. They would explicitly detail their flaws. He has a poor memory, he's not pious, he was known to lie, all to protect the integrity of the Prophet's teachings. This systematic, meticulous Ghibah was considered a collective obligation on the community.
The concept of jarwa ta'dil is so key here. It shows that Ghibah, when it's done with the highest ethical rigor for a critical purpose, isn't just permissible, it's actually essential for preserving sacred knowledge.
It completely shifts the act from being about an individual's rights to a communal obligation. You're not maligning a person for your own reasons. You are protecting the entire community's knowledge base by exposing a specific relevant fault.
Fifth is exposing public sinners.
This is about mentioning someone who openly and flagrantly commits sins or promotes religious innovations in public.
Yeah.
As Ibn Rish mentioned, they have, by their own actions, forfeited their right to concealment regarding that specific public act. The intention of mentioning it must be to correct them, prevent communal harm, or dissuade others from following their example. It can't be used to just humiliate them for the sake of it.
And the final scenario is seeking help against injustice.
This is similar to the first point, complaining to an authority, but it's a bit broader. It can involve asking for help from people who don't have formal judicial power, but who have influence or the ability to intervene on your behalf to stop an injustice.
So we have the 6 scenarios summed up in that line. To complain, to identify, to warn, to make it known, to ask for fatwa, to correct a wrong that's shown. But what stops these from becoming a giant loophole for anyone who just wants to justify their malice?
That's where the 4 strict conceptual guardrails come in. The scholars knew that having exceptions required extreme caution.
Okay, so what are the 4 conditions that have to be met even when you're in one of these permissible situations?
First, sincerity or ikhlas. Your intention must be purely for God's sake, for justice, or for the benefit of the community. It can never be driven by personal anger, revenge, or a secret desire to just insult someone. If malice is the driver, the exception is void.
Second, avoid naming if you can.
You have to minimize the harm. Preserve the person's dignity by only using their name when it's absolutely necessary for the action to be effective. If you can get a religious ruling using vague terms, you are obligated to do so.
Third, mention only what is necessary.
It's strictly to the relevant fault. If you're warning someone about a business partner's financial dishonesty, you are forbidden from then adding, and you know he's also a terrible parent and dresses poorly. No, you avoid exaggeration and stick rigidly to the point of necessity.
And fourth, prevent a greater harm.
This is the final ethical calculation. You have to be sure that your permissible ghibah doesn't end up causing an even greater social or moral evil. For example, if exposing an official would lead to a riot and bloodshed, the initial act might become forbidden because of the greater harm it would cause. The benefit of your speech must clearly outweigh the damage. These 4 conditions are like the ethical lock on the 6 exceptions. They ensure ghibah is only ever permitted when necessity transforms it from an act of degradation into an act of protection.
It's clear that Ghibah is seen as a spiritual disease. And with any disease, the cure has to start with diagnosing the cause. What are the common psychological drivers that lead people down this path?
Identifying the causes is half the battle. The sources are very detailed about these internal pathologies. A lot of ghibah stems from hidden hatred or envy. Tearing down someone who has achieved something you desire. Another huge one is self-justification. If you have a particular flaw, you might point it out in others to make your own feel less severe.
And then you have the purely social drivers.
Absolutely. Anger is a big one, using gossip as a release valve for frustration. Peer pressure is another. People join in with a gossiping group just to fit in and avoid being alienated. And honestly, one of the biggest is just sheer boredom and idleness. When minds aren't constructively engaged, they often turn to dissecting the lives of others.
Which makes the cure sound conceptually simple, even if it's hard to practice. You have to shift your focus from criticizing others to assessing yourself.
It's a total paradigm shift. The statement from Al-Rabi ibn Qutaym is the perfect model. He said, "I am not pleased with myself, so how could I occupy myself with criticizing others?" That's the realization. The energy you spend meticulously cataloging someone else's faults is so much better invested in fixing your own. Self-focus is the ultimate spiritual shield against ghibah.
Okay, so we've talked about avoiding the sin, but what about the proactive virtue? Actively defending the honor of someone who isn't there? This earns a very explicit, very powerful reward.
Yes, moving from passive avoidance to active defense is highly encouraged, and the reward is directly linked to salvation. The Hadith of Asma bint Yazid states, Whoever defends the honor of his brother in his absence, it is a right upon Allah to free him from the fire.
That is a profound promise. God will protect you from the fire on Judgment Day if you protect your brother's reputation in this life.
It shows just how valuable the act is. By protecting your brother's dignity, you are demonstrating the highest level of community loyalty, and God protects you in return. And conversely, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud warned about the consequence of silence. He said whoever hears a believer being backbitten and does not defend them will be punished in this world and the hereafter. The silent listener is considered a partner in the sin.
Because the silence is a form of tacit approval. You're providing the audience that the sin needs to even exist.
That's the conceptual issue. The listener provides the platform, the legitimacy. As the old poetic line goes, the listener of blame is a partner to it, just as the one who consumes food is like the one who eats.
So what if a person has already committed Ghibah? The path to correction is repentance, or tawbah, but this sin is way more complex because it involves harming another person. It's not just between you and God. You have to address two rights, God's right and the individual's right.
Right. For God's right, the process is what you'd expect. You stop the act, you feel sincere remorse, and you ask God for forgiveness. The real complexity, the deep scholarly debate, is around the individual's right. How do you get forgiveness from the person whose honor you violated?
So one position advocated for going directly to the person and asking for their pardon, right?
Yes. Scholars like Al-Ghazali took this position. The argument is structural. Since the wrong was done directly to their honor, the debt has to be paid by asking them for explicit forgiveness. The debt remains on your books until the creditor, the victim, forgives it.
But the alternative view is worried about causing even more harm.
That's the nuanced position of scholars like Ibn Qayyim. They caution that going and telling the victim about the Ghibah might cause them more pain, more distress, more anger, especially if they never knew it happened in the first place. They argued that if asking for pardon will cause more damage than the original sin, then you should avoid it, based on the principle of preventing the greater of two evils.
So if you follow that second path, what is the practical action required for repentance? You can't just do nothing.
The focus shifts completely to active spiritual restitution. It means three things. First, you must publicly replace the negative speech with sincere praise in the very same circles where the backbiting happened. You have to actively repair the reputational damage you caused. Second, you must make sincere and persistent prayer, or du'a, for the victim, asking God to forgive both of you. And third, you should increase your good deeds in their name, acknowledging that you might still have to pay that moral debt on Judgment Day, but you have done everything humanly possible to restore their honor in this world.
That distinction is so important. It recognizes that mending the spiritual debt doesn't always have to involve inflicting new psychological pain. It defines repentance as a public restoration of honor, not just a private confession. This has been a really extensive journey. We went from one simple word, Ghibah, to this incredibly comprehensive ethical system that defines, distinguishes, and condemns all these different forms of harmful speech. We've looked at the spiritual gravity, that analogy of eating dead flesh, the precise boundaries of the exceptions, and the complex path to repentance.
And the core concepts we analyzed really show that Ghibah is seen as a fundamental violation of three sacred things: the sacredness of a person's honor, the sacredness of community trust, and the sacredness of your own spiritual efforts. The whole system is designed to protect reputation as a spiritual asset.
So at the end of the day, what does this all mean for us?
I think it means our default setting for speech has to be silence, unless the words we're about to say are clearly beneficial or fall into one of those 6 very specific constructive exceptions. It just reinforces that timeless wisdom from the Hadith. Whoever believes in Allah on the last day should speak good or remain silent. If there is any potential for harm, silence is the only safe, ethical path.
And as we close, let's just reflect one more time on that profound idea of spiritual currency, the concept of losing your most valuable asset, your good deeds, to the very person you wronged. This is all encapsulated in that story of Ibn Jala, who backbit a companion and then went to ask for forgiveness. The victim refused. And his reason for refusing is maybe the most provocative thought we can end on.
The victim told him, "There is no better deed in my record than the good deeds you're giving me, so how could I erase it?" And that just leaves you with the profound realization that controlling your tongue isn't just about avoiding punishment. It's about rigorously guarding the spiritual currency of your entire life. Because the person you wrong might end up valuing the debt you owe them more than they valued their own ability to forgive. Just think about that exchange and what it implies about the real value of every single word you speak.